Carl Linnaeus, born on May 23, 1707, in the small village of Rashold in Småland, Sweden, emerged as one of the most influential figures in the history of science. He was born into a family with a strong connection to the natural world, which undoubtedly shaped his future path. His father, Niels Linnaeus, was a pastor with a deep love for plants, and his mother, Christina, was known for her kindness and piety. Growing up in an environment that balanced intellectual pursuits with an appreciation for nature, Linnaeus developed a strong curiosity about the natural world from a very young age. Linnaeus' early education was guided primarily by his father, who recognized his son's keen interest in plants and the surrounding environment. However, Linnaeus' formal schooling did not begin until he was a teenager. His academic journey began in the nearby town of Växjö, where he attended school and showed early signs of exceptional talent. While his father encouraged his interest in the natural world, it was the local schoolmaster who played a key role in nurturing Linnaeus' growing intellectual curiosity, particularly in the areas of Latin, mathematics, and natural history. In 1727, at the age of 20, Linnaeus entered Lund University to study medicine. Despite the initial expectation that he would follow in the footsteps of his father and other scholars in the medical field, his interests began to shift. During his time at Lund, Linnaeus found himself more drawn to the study of botany, particularly the identification and classification of plants. This divergence in his focus was not entirely unexpected, given that his childhood had been immersed in the natural world, surrounded by the forests, lakes, and wild landscapes of Sweden. Linnaeus' early academic life was marked by his determination to excel and carve out a niche in a field that was not widely considered prestigious at the time. His pursuit of botany, especially his interest in classification, was seen as an unconventional path for a young medical student. However, his decision to focus on plants was not born from a lack of interest in medicine. Rather, it was the fascination with the intricacies of the natural world that led him to believe that a deeper understanding of living organisms was key to human knowledge and scientific progress. In 1728, Linnaeus transferred to Uppsala University, Sweden's foremost academic institution, where his intellectual journey would take on a more defined trajectory. At Uppsala, Linnaeus encountered the leading scholars of his time, who greatly influenced his academic development. Uppsala was a hub of scientific thought in the 18th century, and its botanical gardens provided Linnaeus with the perfect setting to study plants and refine his classification skills. It was here, in the quietude of the Uppsala Botanical Garden, that Linnaeus began to develop the methods that would later define his groundbreaking work in taxonomy. Though Linnaeus was primarily focused on botany, his time at Uppsala also deepened his understanding of the broader field of natural science, including zoology and mineralogy. It was during this period that he began to formulate the principles that would eventually guide his most famous contributions to science. He developed an interest in the works of other naturalists, especially those of his contemporaries in Europe, such as the Dutch scientist Jan Swammerdam, whose research on insect anatomy influenced Linnaeus' views on classification and the interconnectedness of life forms. Linnaeus' academic life was not without challenges. Despite his growing reputation as a scholar, he often faced skepticism and criticism from his peers. His unconventional approach to science, particularly his insistence on a structured system of classification, was met with resistance from some quarters of the scientific community. Nonetheless, Linnaeus remained undeterred and pushed forward with his studies, convinced that the classification of organisms would become the foundation of all future scientific work. One pivotal moment in Linnaeus' early education came in 1730, when he was granted the opportunity to undertake a study trip to the Netherlands, then one of the centers of botanical research in Europe. This trip was pivotal in Linnaeus' development, as it exposed him to the works of the leading naturalists and botanists of the time. In Amsterdam, Linnaeus met the renowned scientist Herman Boerhaave, whose influence on his thinking was profound. Boerhaave was a celebrated professor of medicine and botany, and his work helped shape Linnaeus' understanding of the need for systematic approaches in scientific inquiry. During his stay in the Netherlands, Linnaeus also had the opportunity to examine the extensive botanical collections housed in the gardens of the great European universities and botanical societies. These experiences reinforced Linnaeus' belief in the need for an organized system of classification, one that would enable scientists to communicate more effectively across geographic and linguistic boundaries. His observations during this period laid the foundation for his later development of the binomial nomenclature system, which would become one of the most enduring aspects of his scientific legacy. Linnaeus' early education culminated in his return to Sweden, where he took up a post as a lecturer at Uppsala University in 1732. His academic credentials had been solidified by his travels and studies abroad, and his reputation as a botanist was growing. However, it was his ambitious vision of organizing the natural world that would soon distinguish him as one of the most innovative scientists of his time. It was during this period that he began to lay the groundwork for his most influential work, Systema Naturae, which would transform the way scientists classify plants, animals, and all living organisms. Carl Linnaeus' discovery of the world of botany was not an instantaneous event, but rather a gradual unfolding of curiosity, exploration, and intellectual awakening. While many of his contemporaries pursued conventional medical careers or theological studies, Linnaeus' growing interest in the natural world led him to focus on the study of plants. This fascination with botany emerged not just from an appreciation of nature's beauty, but from a deeper desire to understand and categorize the vast array of living organisms that populated the world. Linnaeus' transition to botany began during his early years at the University of Lund, though it was at Uppsala University where his passion truly took root. It was here, in the scholarly atmosphere of Uppsala, that he first encountered the work of earlier botanists and naturalists. At the time, European botanical studies were heavily influenced by the traditions of the Renaissance and Baroque periods, where classification schemes were largely inconsistent and varied from one region to another. Linnaeus, however, sought something more structured, something that would allow for a universal method of identifying and understanding plants. During his studies at Uppsala, Linnaeus began to delve into the works of prominent botanists such as Joseph Pitton de Tournefort and John Ray. While their contributions to plant classification were foundational, Linnaeus recognized gaps in their systems. He noticed that there was a lack of consistency in the way plants were categorized. For example, while Tournefort had proposed a system of plant classification based on their flowers and fruits, Linnaeus believed that such a system was too arbitrary. He set out to devise a system that would be more comprehensive and universally applicable, incorporating a hierarchy based on shared characteristics across species. One of the most influential experiences that sparked Linnaeus' dedication to botany was his time spent in the botanical garden at Uppsala. The garden, which housed a wide variety of plant species from all over the world, became Linnaeus' outdoor laboratory. It was here that he began experimenting with his own methods of classification, observing plant structures in great detail and attempting to categorize them based on their shared features. Linnaeus' systematic approach to studying plants was methodical, combining careful observation with the desire to create order out of the chaos of nature. Linnaeus' early research focused primarily on the sexual organs of plants, a relatively novel approach at the time. His work on plant reproduction led him to propose a new way of organizing plants based on their reproductive structures. This groundbreaking method was first articulated in his work, Genera Plantarum, published in 1737, which detailed a system of classification based on the number and arrangement of stamens and pistils in flowers. This new method was radically different from previous systems, which had focused on more general characteristics, such as plant form and leaf structure. Linnaeus' emphasis on reproduction as the key to classification would become one of his most enduring contributions to botanical science. The approach that Linnaeus developed was not just academic. It was also deeply practical. In an age when scientific communication was often hindered by linguistic and cultural barriers, Linnaeus' system provided a common ground for scientists across Europe. By naming plants according to their genus and species, using a binomial, two-part system of nomenclature, Linnaeus created a universal language that could be understood by scholars around the world. His use of Latin for plant names ensured that his system would be accepted across different linguistic regions, enabling international collaboration and the spread of botanical knowledge. Linnaeus' method of classification quickly garnered attention and began to influence botanical research across Europe. Scholars who had previously struggled to organize the vast diversity of plant life began adopting his system. His model not only made botanical studies more systematic, but also more accessible. Linnaeus' new approach allowed plants to be identified and cataloged in a way that was not only consistent, but also reliable, making it easier for researchers to communicate their findings and build on each other's work. The early success of Linnaeus' classification system was, in part, due to the practical applications it offered. Botany had long been regarded as an important part of medicine, as many plants had medicinal properties. By providing a more accurate way of identifying plants, Linnaeus' work offered great promise for the development of pharmacology and herbal medicine. Additionally, his system of classification became increasingly important for botanical gardens, which serve as both research centers and repositories for plant species. As more and more plants were cultivated and studied, Linnaeus' classifications helped ensure that each species could be properly identified and understood. Linnaeus' passion for botany also led him to explore the geographic distribution of plants. He recognized that plants were not randomly scattered across the globe, but were instead found in specific climates, elevations, and regions. This realization spurred Linnaeus to study plant life in a global context, and he began to chart the distribution of species based on their habitats. In his later works, Linnaeus would not only classify plants, but also examine the relationships between plants and the environments they inhabited. This study of the ecology of plants helped lay the groundwork for future research in biogeography and environmental science. Despite the growing acceptance of his botanical methods, Linnaeus' approach was not without its critics. Some scholars, particularly those who adhered to more traditional systems of classification, were initially skeptical of his ideas. They questioned the practicality of a system based on reproductive organs, arguing that it was too abstract and difficult to apply to all plant species. Linnaeus, however, was undeterred by these criticisms. His commitment to his system was unwavering, and he continued to refine his methods, making adjustments where necessary while remaining true to the core principles of his vision. As Linnaeus continued his work in botany, he also began to extend his system of classification to other forms of life, including animals and minerals. But it was his groundbreaking work with plants that would cement his place in history as one of the pioneers of modern taxonomy. Through his observations, classification systems, and tireless commitment to the study of nature, Linnaeus fundamentally changed the way humans interact with the natural world. His approach to botany did not simply aim to catalog the diversity of life. It sought to impose order on what had previously been seen as chaotic, paving the way for future generations of scientists to build on his work. After Carl Linnaeus' time spent abroad, it was his return to Sweden that would mark a critical phase in his development as a scholar and a key period in the maturation of his ideas. By the time he returned to Uppsala in 1732, Linnaeus had gained a reputation in European scientific circles as a promising young botanist and classifier. His travels through Europe had broadened his academic horizons, but it was in Sweden that he began to truly shape the course of his career, not only by consolidating his ideas, but also by contributing to the burgeoning scientific community in his homeland. Upon his return, Linnaeus took up a position as a lecturer at Uppsala University. Although he had already begun to establish himself as a researcher, the university gave him the platform to further develop his ideas. It was here that he became known for his distinct teaching style, one that was systematic, enthusiastic, and deeply engaging. Linnaeus' ability to impart knowledge was remarkable, and his lectures drew large crowds. His students, who came from all over Europe, were not only captivated by his infectious passion for science, but also by his pioneering approach to botany and classification. The botanical gardens at Uppsala, where Linnaeus had spent countless hours observing plants during his earlier years, continued to be an essential part of his work. He transformed the garden into a living laboratory, one that reflected his growing conviction that nature could be understood through the application of systematic principles. Linnaeus made it a priority to organize the garden into distinct sections, each corresponding to specific groups of plants, according to the principles of his classification system. This practical arrangement of plants not only served as a teaching tool for his students, but also exemplified Linnaeus' belief that nature itself could be classified, observed, and understood through logical organization. As Linnaeus' reputation spread, he became deeply involved in the scientific and intellectual life of Sweden. He attracted an increasing number of students, many of whom would go on to make significant contributions to science themselves. Linnaeus was not simply a teacher. He was a mentor, guiding the next generation of naturalists with the same rigor and enthusiasm that had driven his own intellectual development. His ability to inspire and lead made Uppsala University a major center for the study of natural history and botany during the 18th century. In these years, Linnaeus also began to collaborate more extensively with fellow scholars across Europe. The success of his early works, particularly the Systema Naturae and Species Plantarum, prompted him to expand his network of correspondence. He maintained a prolific correspondence with botanists, zoologists, and physicians across the continent, exchanging ideas and discussing the progress of scientific research. This network of intellectuals became invaluable in helping Linnaeus refine his ideas and disseminate his classification system to a wider audience. However, Linnaeus was not merely an academic figure detached from the practical realities of life. He was deeply involved in the scientific exploration of Sweden's natural environment. As the royal physician to the Swedish king, Linnaeus often undertook expeditions to remote parts of Sweden, studying the flora and fauna of the country. These expeditions were instrumental in expanding the scope of his classification system, as they provided him with first-hand observations of previously unrecorded plant and animal species. His fieldwork allowed him to connect the theoretical aspects of his system with real-world examples, thereby enriching his understanding of how nature could be organized. In the midst of his academic and fieldwork pursuits, Linnaeus also began to focus on the practical applications of his work. The scientific community in Sweden, as elsewhere in Europe, had been growing increasingly concerned with issues of agriculture and economy. Linnaeus, ever the pragmatic thinker, saw the potential for his work to benefit the Swedish economy. He realized that if plants could be more accurately classified and understood, it might be possible to improve agricultural practices and the cultivation of beneficial plants. His interest in agriculture led him to study the medicinal uses of plants, as well as their potential for industrial applications. This connection between botany and industry would become an important part of his broader scientific contributions. Despite his success and growing fame, Linnaeus faced challenges in Sweden, both professionally and personally. His insistence on the primacy of his classification system did not always sit well with other scholars, particularly those who were more conservative in their approach to science. The academic establishment at the time was not always receptive to Linnaeus' radical ideas, and he often had to defend his work against criticism. However, Linnaeus' confidence in his methods and his unyielding belief in the utility of his system helped him to overcome opposition, and he continued to work tirelessly on refining his ideas. Linnaeus' personal life also had its complexities. He married Sarah Maria More E.A. in 1739, and together they had several children. His wife, though supportive of his work, often had to balance the demands of family life with Linnaeus' professional commitments. Despite his devotion to his scientific endeavors, Linnaeus was also deeply family-oriented, and he took great pride in the accomplishments of his children, many of whom would later play important roles in Sweden's academic and scientific communities. However, his intense dedication to his work sometimes led to tensions within the household, as Linnaeus was often preoccupied with his research and teaching. Throughout these years, Linnaeus' impact on Swedish science continued to grow. He not only became a key figure in the academic life of Uppsala University, but also helped to elevate Sweden's standing in the global scientific community. The years Linnaeus spent in Sweden allowed him to solidify his position as a leading botanist and naturalist, one whose work would influence not just his contemporaries, but generations of scientists to come. His tireless efforts in both the classroom and the field left a legacy that would forever change the way humanity understood the natural world. Carl Linnaeus was never content with studying nature from the confines of a classroom or library. His desire to understand the natural world in its full complexity drove him to venture beyond the academic environment into the untamed landscapes of Sweden and beyond. These scientific expeditions became a defining feature of his career. Through them, Linnaeus was able to engage directly with the environments that he sought to classify, offering him both the empirical data and the experiential insight needed to refine his revolutionary systems of taxonomy. One of the earliest and most significant of these expeditions took place in 1732, when Linnaeus embarked on a journey to Lapland, a vast and sparsely populated region in the far north of Sweden. This journey was funded by the Royal Society of Sciences in Uppsala and would become legendary for its breadth, ambition, and scientific value. Linnaeus traveled over 2,000 kilometers, mostly on foot or horseback, through mountains, forests, and marshlands. The harsh and rugged terrain, combined with unpredictable weather, made the journey a physically demanding endeavor. But for Linnaeus, the hardships were outweighed by the scientific riches to be uncovered. During the Lapland expedition, Linnaeus meticulously documented hundreds of plant and animal species, many of which were previously unknown to science. He carried with him a modest collection of tools, a notebook, magnifying glass, sample containers, and a botanical press. Each evening, he would carefully record his findings, noting the physical features, habitats, and behaviors of the organisms he encountered. His observations were not limited to flora and fauna. He also paid close attention to geological formations, mineral compositions, and even cultural practices of the indigenous Sami people, whose way of life fascinated him as much as the landscape itself. Linnaeus' detailed field notes from Lapland would later form the basis for his work Flora Lapponica, published in 1737. This book, one of his earliest major publications, was more than just a catalog of northern plants. It was a model of scientific fieldwork. It combined classification, description, and ecology in a way that was remarkably advanced for its time. In Flora Lapponica, Linnaeus introduced many of the taxonomic principles that he would later formalize, while also reflecting on the interdependence between species and their environments, a notion that prefigured ecological thinking. Encouraged by the success of the Lapland expedition, Linnaeus organized and participated in several more journeys across Sweden. One of the most fruitful of these was his 1741 voyage to the islands of Öland and Gotland in the Baltic Sea. These islands, with their unique microclimates and distinct ecosystems, presented a new array of botanical and zoological curiosities. Linnaeus approached the islands with the same rigor and enthusiasm as he had in Lapland, conducting daily explorations, collecting specimens, and sketching his observations with precision. His work on these islands greatly expanded his knowledge of coastal and marine plants, as well as bird and insect species not found on the mainland. Another important expedition took him to Västergötland in 1746, a region in southern Sweden known for its agricultural potential and rich biodiversity. Here, Linnaeus extended his focus to include agricultural plants, livestock breeds, and local farming techniques. He was deeply interested in how humans interacted with the land, and he saw in these patterns both ecological insight and economic opportunity. His reports from this journey often included recommendations for improving local agriculture, including crop rotation methods and the cultivation of useful medicinal plants. His concern for national self-sufficiency and sustainable land use placed him ahead of his time in considering how science could serve society. In addition to his own journeys, Linnaeus trained and dispatched a generation of young naturalists to conduct scientific exploration across the globe. These students, known as the Apostles of Linnaeus, traveled to far-reaching places such as South Africa, Japan, China, the Americas, and the Middle East. They brought back specimens, drawings, and detailed notes, which Linnaeus integrated into his growing body of scientific work. Through these apostles, Linnaeus extended his reach far beyond Sweden, turning his university in Uppsala into a center for global natural history research. His influence, disseminated through these expeditions, was crucial in making taxonomy a worldwide endeavor. Linnaeus understood the importance of documentation and often insisted that exploration must be systematic, with a strong emphasis on classification and precision. He established strict guidelines for his students to follow while in the field, emphasizing consistent naming conventions and the importance of ecological context. These principles helped standardize scientific observation, and the discipline he instilled in his students became one of the hallmarks of modern field biology. The notes, samples, and insights collected during these expeditions flowed back into Uppsala like a continuous current, feeding Linnaeus' ever-expanding classification system. Perhaps one of the most striking aspects of Linnaeus' expeditions was his deep appreciation for the unity of nature. As he traversed forests, coastlines, and mountainous regions, he developed an increasing awareness of the interconnectedness of all life forms. He observed patterns in the distribution of species, correlations between climate and vegetation, and similarities between organisms separated by vast distances. These observations would later form the conceptual basis for his ideas about the balance of nature, long before the term ecosystem entered the scientific vocabulary. Among Carl Linnaeus' many achievements, one stands as perhaps the most revolutionary and enduring: the creation of the binomial nomenclature system. This deceptively simple method of naming organisms using two Latin words, the genus and the species, redefined how the natural world was understood, discussed, and categorized. Before Linnaeus introduced this system, scientific names were long, unwieldy descriptions in Latin that varied from one scholar to another. By establishing a consistent, universal structure, Linnaeus laid the groundwork for modern taxonomy and forever altered the language of biology. The intellectual seeds of this system were sown during Linnaeus' early encounters with plant classification. As he cataloged more species and studied their relationships, he found existing naming systems cumbersome and inconsistent. Many names were descriptive phrases, sometimes more than a dozen words long, intended to detail the plant's characteristics. These names were difficult to memorize and nearly impossible to standardize across regions and languages. Linnaeus recognized that science needed a language as orderly and systematic as the organisms it sought to describe. Linnaeus' solution was to assign each species a two-part name. The first part denoting the genus, a broader category to which the organism belonged, and the second identifying the specific species within that genus. This allowed for a concise and universally applicable naming convention that emphasized relationships between organisms. For example, in Homo sapiens, Homo refers to the genus shared with closely related species, and sapiens specifies the unique species, humans. This approach not only streamlined communication, but also introduced a logical framework for organizing biological diversity. The publication of Species Plantarum in 1753 marked the formal beginning of this naming system. In this monumental work, Linnaeus applied binomial nomenclature to over 6,000 species of plants, systematically naming each using his two-word method. The clarity and order presented in Species Plantarum were immediately recognized by the scientific community. It represented a dramatic departure from previous attempts to catalog nature and quickly became the definitive reference for plant classification. Linnaeus' system wasn't just about efficiency. It reflected a philosophical vision. He saw the binomial system as a mirror of nature's own order, an expression of divine design. To him, the simplicity and symmetry of the naming structure echoed the rationality he perceived in the natural world. By naming organisms in a consistent way, Linnaeus believed he was not only aiding scientific understanding, but also honoring the structure embedded in creation itself. This view lent his work a sense of purpose beyond the purely practical, blending scientific rigor with a reverence for nature. As the system gained traction, it became clear that binomial nomenclature offered more than a way to label species. It was a tool for building a map of life's diversity. Taxonomy, once a loosely defined discipline, began to mature into a formal science. Organisms could now be grouped and compared based on shared characteristics, and their relationships visualized with greater precision. Linnaeus' structure provided the scaffolding upon which evolutionary theories and ecological models would later be constructed, even though he himself did not theorize about evolution in the Darwinian sense. The adoption of binomial nomenclature was not without controversy. Some scholars resisted the changes, clinging to traditional naming systems out of familiarity or skepticism. Others worried that the reduction of an organism to just 2 words stripped away the nuance of descriptive names. Linnaeus responded with unwavering confidence. He argued that science required clarity and that naming should serve discovery, not obscure it. Over time, his logic proved persuasive, and the scientific community increasingly embraced the new standard. Linnaeus also recognized the importance of accessibility. By writing in Latin, a language still used in scholarly circles, he ensured that his system transcended national boundaries. Scientists from France to Russia, from Britain to the Americas, could adopt his nomenclature without translation barriers. This universality was crucial in an era when global exploration was rapidly accelerating and new species were being discovered at an unprecedented rate. With binomial nomenclature, a plant found in South America could be studied and referenced by a botanist in Sweden or a physician in Italy with complete clarity. Beyond plants, Linnaeus extended binomial naming to animals in subsequent works, such as the later editions of Systema Naturae. As he expanded the system to include mammals, birds, fish, and insects, the true versatility of binomial nomenclature came into full view. It could be applied to all forms of life, providing a common language for the entirety of biology. Linnaeus even ventured into mineral classification, although the system proved less effective in the inorganic realm. Nevertheless, his insistence on systematic naming forever reshaped how natural scientists approach classification. Carl Linnaeus was not merely a scientist immersed in solitary work. He was, above all, a teacher. At the heart of his career was a commitment to education, not only in the form of lectures or university curricula, but through mentorship, inspiration, and the cultivation of a generation of naturalists who would carry his legacy far beyond the borders of Sweden. His role as an educator was foundational to the spread of his ideas, and the intellectual community he built around himself served as one of the most dynamic forces in 18th century science. When Linnaeus returned to Uppsala University as a professor, his lectures quickly became renowned for their clarity, structure, and passion. Students from across Europe made pilgrimages to attend his classes, eager to learn not just from his theories, but from the way he engaged with the natural world. He had a unique ability to take complex botanical and zoological concepts and present them with compelling simplicity. His lectures were often held in gardens, forests, or greenhouses, where students could see and touch the specimens being discussed. He believed deeply that direct contact with nature was essential for scientific understanding. Unlike many professors of his time, Linnaeus did not hold his students at a distance. He saw them as collaborators, capable of contributing meaningfully to the expanding scientific enterprise. He gave them responsibilities, encouraged their questions, and often included them in his research projects. In this way, Linnaeus created a learning environment that was both rigorous and nurturing, where students felt empowered to explore and experiment under his guidance. His open-door approach to teaching became a model for future institutions of scientific learning. The most illustrious outcome of his mentorship was the creation of the Apostles of Linnaeus, a group of exceptionally dedicated students whom he personally trained and then sent on scientific expeditions around the globe. These young men traveled to distant lands including South Africa, the Middle East, China, Japan, and the Americas. Their missions were not mere adventures, but structured scientific undertakings, carefully planned by Linnaeus and meticulously executed by his disciples. Each apostle carried with him the intellectual tools and methods of his mentor, and their reports, collections, and writings enriched the scientific community back in Uppsala. These expeditions were not without risk. Several of Linnaeus' apostles died abroad due to disease, accidents, or conflict. Yet Linnaeus remained committed to their missions, believing their work to be part of a greater scientific calling. When news arrived of a student's death, he mourned personally but found solace in the knowledge that their contributions to science would endure. He often memorialized their efforts in his writings and kept their collections preserved in the university's growing natural history archives. In the classroom, Linnaeus instilled not just knowledge, but a philosophy of science based on observation, categorization, and systematic thought. He taught his students to seek patterns in nature, to remain methodical in their studies, and to be cautious in drawing conclusions. His approach emphasized discipline and humility in the face of nature's complexity. To him, a true scientist was not someone who merely collected curiosities, but one who sought the underlying logic that governed the natural world. Linnaeus also introduced innovative pedagogical tools. He developed visual aids, classification charts, and teaching gardens that allowed students to immerse themselves in the learning process. In his botanical garden at Uppsala, he arranged the plants in accordance with his taxonomic principles, making it a living classroom. Each section served as a visual representation of scientific theory, helping students internalize abstract concepts through real-life application. These methods proved so effective that they were adopted by universities and botanical institutions throughout Europe. Beyond science, Linnaeus encouraged his students to develop a sense of moral and civic responsibility. He believed that scientific knowledge should serve society, that it should improve agriculture, medicine, and daily life. In his writings and teachings, he often connected natural science to human welfare, urging his students to consider the broader implications of their work. Many of his disciples would go on to become prominent physicians, educators, and government advisors, applying Linnaean principles in public service. Linnaeus' mentorship extended beyond the walls of the university. He maintained correspondence with his former students for decades, advising them on their research and offering support as they advanced in their careers. This network of communication functioned as a proto-scientific community in which ideas, specimens, and data were exchanged across continents. His ability to keep this network active speaks not only to his organizational skill, but to the deep loyalty and admiration he inspired in his pupils. The written word was one of Carl Linnaeus' most enduring tools, a medium through which he shaped not only the science of his time, but also the trajectory of biological thought for centuries to come. His publications were more than academic treatises. They were blueprints for the organization of nature, meticulously crafted to reflect his vision of a world governed by order and system. In an era when the cataloging of the natural world was still fragmented and inconsistent, Linnaeus' printed works became foundational texts that offered clarity, structure, and a universal language to the scientific community. Among his most influential publications was Systema Naturae, first published in 1735 in a slim volume of only a dozen pages. It began modestly, but its successive editions would grow into a comprehensive taxonomic framework for the natural world. Each new edition expanded the scope and precision of Linnaeus' classifications, ultimately encompassing not just plants, but animals and minerals as well. The 10th edition, published in 1758, marked a crucial turning point. It formalized the binomial nomenclature system for animals, setting the standards still used today. In this way, Systema Naturae became the cornerstone of modern taxonomy, a reference book that guided scientists across continents. Another cornerstone was Species Plantarum, published in 1753, which provided the first consistently applied binomial names for plants. This work cataloged more than 6,000 species and served as a botanical complement to Systema Naturae. What distinguished Species Plantarum was its precision and accessibility. Each entry was concise, uniformly formatted, and referenced existing descriptions and illustrations. Linnaeus aimed to create not only a scientific inventory, but also a practical guide that botanists and explorers could carry into the field. The book's clear structure and Latin nomenclature allowed it to transcend linguistic barriers, accelerating its adoption worldwide. Linnaeus' writing style, though methodical, was not devoid of personality. His texts were filled with subtle wit, observational insight, and occasional poetic flourishes. He often used metaphors to explain complex ideas, comparing taxonomic structures to familial hierarchies or architectural designs. This ability to merge scientific rigor with literary elegance helped make his works widely readable and engaging, even to those outside strict academic circles. He understood that communication was as important as discovery, and he took care to ensure that his readers not only understood his system, but were inspired by it. Beyond his major works, Linnaeus authored numerous essays, dissertations, and travel reports. These writings covered a wide range of topics, from the economic uses of native Swedish plants to the medicinal properties of exotic herbs collected by his students abroad. In Materia Medica, he compiled information on pharmacologically significant plants, many of which he had studied in person or through his correspondence. These medical writings bridged the gap between botany and healthcare, demonstrating how taxonomy could serve practical human needs. His integration of plant science with medicine helped lay the foundation for modern pharmacognosy. Linnaeus also produced teaching manuals, such as Philosophia Botanica, in which he outlined the philosophical and methodological principles behind his classification systems. This text served as a pedagogical guide for aspiring botanists, explaining not only how to identify and name species, but why such organization was essential to scientific understanding. With definitions, diagrams, and clear explanations, Philosophia Botanica distilled the essence of Linnaean thinking into a single, coherent philosophy. It became a core text in botanical education, widely used by universities across Europe. The publishing process in the 18th century was not as straightforward as it is today, and Linnaeus often faced challenges in securing funding and managing the logistics of distribution. Nevertheless, he was deeply involved in every stage, from writing and editing to working with engravers on scientific illustrations. He took special care with diagrams and tables, recognizing their importance in conveying structure and relationships. His attention to visual representation, particularly in the classification trees and tabular formats, made his publications not just informative but visually intuitive. Linnaeus was also keenly aware of his place in the broader intellectual network of Europe. He maintained an active correspondence with publishers, naturalists, and academic institutions, ensuring that his works reached key audiences. Many of his books were translated into multiple languages during his lifetime, with editions appearing in German, French, Dutch, and English. These translations helped solidify his status as a central figure in Enlightenment science and ensured that his ideas could circulate well beyond Swedish borders. The reception of Linnaeus' publications was not universally enthusiastic. Some naturalists resisted the constraints of his system, arguing that it oversimplified the complexities of living organisms. Others disliked the authority he seemed to exert through his nomenclature, feeling that scientific naming should be a more democratic and descriptive process. Nevertheless, even critics often found themselves compelled to engage with his methods, if only because his works had become so widely adopted. In this way, Linnaeus' print legacy was not merely influential, it was inescapable. While Carl Linnaeus' name is often associated with global taxonomy and botanical exploration, a significant part of his life's work was dedicated to the natural history of his homeland, Sweden. To Linnaeus, Sweden was not merely a place of origin. It was a living laboratory teeming with flora, fauna, minerals, and ecological systems that deserve the same attention as the more exotic landscapes his students ventured to explore. His careful study of Swedish nature not only reflected his patriotism, but also illustrated his conviction that scientific inquiry need not be limited to distant lands to yield profound discoveries. Linnaeus' deep engagement with Sweden's natural landscape began early in his career. During his formative years, he embarked on several scientific journeys across the country, often sponsored by the Swedish government or academic institutions. These expeditions took him to regions such as Lapland in the far north, Dalarna in the central interior, and Öland and Gotland in the Baltic Sea. With notebook in hand, he recorded every detail, from the altitude at which a plant was found to the customs of local populations and the quality of regional soils. These observations would later form the basis of some of his most influential regional studies. One of the most celebrated of these journeys was his 1732 expedition to Lapland, undertaken when he was just 25 years old. The trip was physically demanding, requiring travel by foot, horseback, and boat through rugged terrain. But for Linnaeus, it was a journey of revelation. The harsh northern climate yielded a surprising variety of plants, many of which had never been described in scientific literature. He documented over 100 new species and noted unique adaptations that allowed life to flourish in the Arctic Circle. His account of this voyage, later published as Iter Laponicum, captured not only the biological richness of Lapland, but also Linnaeus' philosophical musings on nature's resilience and ingenuity. Linnaeus' work in Sweden was not limited to plants. He also studied animals in meticulous detail, often focusing on how they interacted with local environments. From reindeer in the north to wild boars and lynxes in the south, he classified and described each organism with a blend of scientific precision and ecological insight. He paid attention to breeding patterns, feeding habits, and habitats, creating comprehensive field profiles that would later assist in conservation and agriculture. His observations on animal behavior also influenced how Swedes understood and managed their natural resources. The mineral wealth of Sweden was another focal point of Linnaeus' research. He visited mines, observed geological formations, and analyzed mineral samples with a systematic eye. Although his classification of minerals did not gain the same enduring status as his biological taxonomy, it nonetheless contributed to Sweden's economic and scientific development. He advocated for the efficient use of native resources and often advised the government on the commercial and medicinal potential of Swedish minerals, herbs, and forest products. Linnaeus believed that Sweden's natural wealth could support a stronger, healthier, and more self-sufficient nation. In many of his writings, he championed the idea of economic botany, the practical use of native plants for food, medicine, textiles, and industry. He encouraged the cultivation of crops like flax and hops, promoted beekeeping, and even proposed experiments with native plants to create substitutes for imported goods. His proposals were often grounded in data gathered from his regional surveys and experiments, underscoring his commitment to applied science. A particularly impactful aspect of Linnaeus' work was his involvement in public health through natural remedies. He cataloged medicinal plants found in Sweden and tested their efficacy through consultations with local healers and his own medical background. This fusion of traditional knowledge and scientific method reflected Linnaeus' holistic approach to nature and society. He recognized the value of local wisdom while striving to integrate it into a formal, empirical framework. Linnaeus also contributed to the growing sense of national identity in 18th century Sweden. At a time when European powers were expanding their empires and scientific institutions, Linnaeus positioned Sweden as a serious player in the global intellectual arena. By highlighting the richness of his country's ecosystems and producing internationally respected research based on them, he instilled pride in Sweden's natural heritage. He encouraged young scientists to explore their homeland with the same fervor that others reserve for the tropics or far-flung islands. Throughout his life, Linnaeus remained committed to preserving Sweden's biodiversity. He was one of the early voices to warn against overharvesting and habitat destruction. Although conservation as a discipline had not yet fully emerged, his writings often carried a tone of stewardship, urging landowners and policymakers to protect valuable ecosystems. His understanding of the delicate balance between human activity and natural systems was ahead of its time and foreshadowed later environmental movements. Carl Linnaeus was, above all, a man of science. Yet behind his empirical rigor and taxonomic discipline lay a profound philosophical and theological framework that quietly shaped his entire worldview. He did not perceive nature as a random collection of living things to be sorted and labeled. Instead, he saw it as an intricately ordered manifestation of divine design. His classifications were not only acts of science, but also, in his eyes, expressions of a deeper metaphysical order, a reflection of the mind of God. Linnaeus was born and raised in a deeply religious Lutheran household, where the natural world was often interpreted as a revelation of God's wisdom. This upbringing left an indelible impression on his thinking. Even as he matured into a scientist who relied on observation and logic, he never entirely separated the material from the spiritual. To Linnaeus, studying nature was akin to reading a sacred text. He frequently referred to the earth as the theater of God's glory, a place where divine intelligence could be seen in the symmetry of flowers, the instincts of animals, and the complex interdependence of ecosystems. This theologically infused perspective is evident in the very structure of Linnaeus' scientific system. His hierarchical classification of living things, kingdom, class, order, genus, and species, mirrored the hierarchical order he believed governed the cosmos. Just as society had its ranks, and the heavens their celestial arrangement, nature too was composed of levels, each defined by purpose and precision. Linnaeus saw in this organization not only a method for understanding the world, but evidence of a cosmic architect whose wisdom was beyond human comprehension. Moreover, Linnaeus was particularly fascinated by the idea of species constancy. He believed that all species were created in their current forms and had remained unchanged since the moment of their creation. While later scientific developments would challenge this idea, at the time, it aligned perfectly with contemporary theological thought. Linnaeus saw the consistency of species traits across generations as further proof of divine perfection. Each organism was designed for a specific niche, fulfilling its role in an ecological balance that reflected the harmony of a divinely ordered system. In his writings, Linnaeus often employed language that merged the scientific and the sacred. He spoke of nature as the handiwork of the Almighty and referred to himself as a priest in the temple of nature. This self-conception was more than metaphorical. It reflected a genuine reverence for his scientific work, which he viewed as a form of worship. Unlike some contemporaries who feared that scientific inquiry could undermine religious belief, Linnaeus saw the two as intertwined. For him, to classify and name the parts of creation was to participate, in a humble way, in God's creative act. Linnaeus also engaged in philosophical reflection beyond the realm of biology. He contemplated the nature of beauty, order, and utility in the natural world, asking whether these qualities arose merely from human perception or from something objectively embedded in creation. He tended to favor the latter view, that beauty in nature was not a subjective illusion, but a real and intentional feature, placed by the Creator to both sustain and delight humanity. The symmetry of leaves, the coloration of birds, the geometric perfection of crystals, these, to Linnaeus, were more than aesthetic phenomena. They were signatures of a benevolent intelligence. Interestingly, Linnaeus was also drawn to the notion of the great chain of being, a classical idea that had regained popularity during his lifetime. This philosophical concept proposed that all life forms existed in a continuous, ascending order, from the simplest creatures to humans and ultimately to angels and God. While Linnaeus' scientific system was more pragmatic than speculative, traces of this hierarchical vision can be found in how he organized organisms and described their relationships. He believed that understanding nature's ladder was, in part, understanding one's place in the cosmos. Despite his strong theological convictions, Linnaeus was cautious about dogmatism. He rarely allowed religious doctrine to override empirical evidence, and he often stressed the importance of direct observation over inherited belief. However, when empirical findings and theological interpretations aligned, as they often did in his eyes, he saw it as confirmation that truth could be both revealed and discovered. His worldview was a delicate balancing act, navigating between faith and reason without collapsing into either mysticism or materialism. Linnaeus' blending of science and theology also extended to his views on humanity. He believed humans were unique among all species, not only because of their rational faculties, but also because of their moral responsibilities. In his classification system, humans were given a place within the animal kingdom, an idea that sparked some controversy. But he maintained that what distinguished humans most was their capacity for spiritual insight. He wrote that while man shares his body with beasts, he shares his soul with angels. In this duality, Linnaeus saw the full spectrum of human nature, part of the natural world, yet transcending it. As Carl Linnaeus entered the final chapter of his life, the exuberance and unrelenting curiosity that had defined his earlier years began to mellow into a quieter, more contemplative rhythm. Though age brought physical limitations, it did little to dampen his intellectual engagement. Residing primarily at Hammarby, his countryside estate near Uppsala, Linnaeus spent his later years immersed in his garden, surrounded by the very subjects that had captivated him for a lifetime: plants, insects, and the subtle rhythms of the natural world. This estate, more than a retreat, became a living archive of his botanical vision, containing exotic and native species meticulously arranged according to his own taxonomic principles. His academic duties lessened over time, though he retained his title as professor and maintained a respected presence within the university. Former students, colleagues, and admirers frequently visited him at Hammarby, eager to consult the aging master. Linnaeus welcomed these guests warmly, often leading them on slow walks through his garden paths or engaging them in animated conversations about recent scientific developments. His mind remained sharp, though his body grew frail. Periodic strokes began to trouble him by the mid-1770s, weakening his movements and speech, yet he continued writing notes, editing texts, and dictating observations as long as he was physically able. In these twilight years, Linnaeus began to reflect more openly on the arc of his own life. He compiled autobiographical notes, documented his travels, and reviewed his publications with a critical eye. He was acutely aware of his place in scientific history and, like many great thinkers nearing the end of their lives, sought to ensure that his life's work would be preserved and understood. With the assistance of his son, Carl Linnaeus the Younger, himself a budding naturalist, he organized his manuscripts, correspondence, and specimen collections for safekeeping. The father-son relationship between the two was affectionate, though tinged with the natural tension of legacy and expectation. Linnaeus the Elder had high hopes for his namesake and entrusted him with the task of continuing the Linnaean tradition. The younger Linnaeus published some work under his father's supervision and showed promise in botany, but the burden of living in the shadow of a scientific titan proved challenging. Despite his efforts, he never quite emerged from his father's towering reputation. Nonetheless, Carl Linnaeus cherished his son's companionship and took pride in their shared commitment to natural history. Linnaeus' health began to deteriorate more rapidly after 1776. He suffered a series of debilitating strokes, which left him partially paralyzed and increasingly dependent on his family and attendants. Although he could no longer write, he found comfort in being surrounded by his library, his herbarium, and the soft presence of the garden he had nurtured. Nature, which had been his subject of study for decades, now offered him solace in a more intimate, personal way. He would often be seen gazing out of his window at the changing seasons, taking quiet pleasure in the subtle transformations of the landscape. On January 10, 1778, Carl Linnaeus passed away in Hammarby at the age of 70. His death marked the end of an era in natural science, and tributes quickly poured in from across Europe. He was buried in Uppsala Cathedral, a fitting resting place for a man who had given so much to the intellectual and cultural life of the city. His funeral was attended by dignitaries, students, scientists, and townspeople, all of whom recognized that the world had lost a figure of rare genius and vision. After his death, Linnaeus' collections, notes, and botanical samples became the subject of much interest. In a significant transaction, his personal scientific library and herbarium were purchased by the British naturalist Sir James Edward Smith and brought to England. There, they became the foundation of the Linnaean Society of London, an institution dedicated to the study and advancement of biological classification. This transfer ensured that Linnaeus' legacy would not be confined to Sweden, but would continue to shape scientific research on an international scale. The influence of Carl Linnaeus can still be felt today. His binomial nomenclature system remains the standard in biological classification, forming the basis of how species are named and organized in every branch of the life sciences. Museums, botanical gardens, and universities around the world house species named in his honor. Linnea borealis, his favorite flower, being perhaps the most poetic tribute. Statues of Linnaeus stand in cities as varied as Uppsala, London, and Chicago, commemorating not just the man, but the intellectual revolution he spearheaded. Linnaeus' legacy also lives on in the spirit of his methodology, his insistence on structure, clarity, and universality in the pursuit of knowledge. He laid the groundwork for what would become evolutionary biology, systematics, and ecology, even if he himself did not espouse the theories that later scientists would develop. What he did provide was a framework, an intellectual scaffolding that allowed others to climb further into the understanding of life. In remembering Carl Linnaeus, one must look beyond the classifications and the Latin names. His true contribution lies in his transformation of how humanity sees the natural world. He brought order to what had been chaos, and in doing so, he gave generations of scientists a language and a lens through which to view life's complexity. His final years may have been quiet, but the echo of his work continues to resound, as vital today as it was in the century of its conception.